What has TLA done to adapt to the flat annual dues over the last few years? One item is to reduce the operating fund costs and services. So items that may be a nice to have versus a must have either been reduced or eliminated. Also diverted all available funds to the restricted capital reserves fund for infrastructure maintenance and replacement, and also deferred some projects that otherwise would have been scheduled by now. The association conducted a community survey that, among other items, sought to understand better the vote results, and also completed a reserve study to determine the degree of financial risk based on the association's reserve levels. These are just some examples of cost eliminations that we have made over the last few years. Seasonal cookouts have been eliminated, along with off-duty county police patrol, marinas marketing, strategic plan projects, closed the recycling center. We turned off the marina live stream cameras that had a hosting charge for them, as well as the interactive website maps that had a hosting charge as well. As we start looking at cost reduction examples, we decreased the center island maintenance, the mailbox sign, painting frequency, contract tree pruning, printing costs, camera maintenance and replacement, and some staffing costs. The association also has been impacted, like so many other businesses, by COVID-19 for both revenues and expenses. One item for revenues is the commercial vehicle registration. That already was trending downward at the beginning of the year versus previous years as the economy began slowing. And now with COVID-19, we expect to end the year more than $100,000 less than our 2020 budget. Also, as previously reported, the Landings Club has ended its security agreement with the association as of the end of May. Now that included 24/7 response by the landing security, as well as scheduled property checks. They're going to a little bit of a different model now, but that means a loss of revenue of close to $70,000 in 2020, as well as almost $119,000 in future years. At this point, there is not a plan to reduce the number of security officers for the Landings Association. Instead, the intent is to redeploy officers that now have the time available that are not spent on club checks and responses to the community pass. This is an area that we have heard continuous complaints about the last few years: golf carts versus cyclists versus pedestrians. And we will get the security golf cart out there more and security personnel out there more for patrols to try to impact this positively. As for expenses, bad debt expense spiked when the assessment payments were due. We saw a much higher delinquency than we had in previous years. That's starting to come back under control a little bit, but we're still looking at potentially $100,000 more than the 2020 budget. We will keep working on that. In addition, we're projecting spending close to $100,000 directly related to COVID-19. Some of that is the personal protective equipment, enhanced cleaning, and also for a short time, our frontline critical workforce employees like public works and security had temporary enhanced pay. That has since ended, but as we were just getting the handle on that, that was an item. The community survey mentioned earlier, we had about half of the owners participate, which is a very strong rate. And the question related to assessments, annual dues, increase to fund future capital expenditures, most favored that versus special assessment vote or borrowing money and putting the association into debt. As reported at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, the Landings Association had an independent reserve specialist conduct an on-site inspection and evaluation of our thousands of capital assets and the reserve funding methodology. And we have close to $80 million in assets. There's a couple of different ways to look at what's the appropriate reserve funding. Certainly, if you had 100% full funding, that's the least risk of deferred maintenance or special assessments, but there's a large required contribution. So the National Reserve Standards has an alternate way of looking at this, and it's a minimum 30% to 70% fully funded reserves for an adequate, is what they call it, level of funding. So when the reserve study was complete, it determined the Capital Reserves Fund is too low to maintain the Landings Association assets in the future, and it did recommend having at least the minimum 30% balance of the future costs.